your mindfulness and yoga practice have your own individual practice that happens to the world, your action. She also has led movement from step aerobics in the 90s.
Oh, you can't out me with that one. That's like my secret.
They don't even probably know it's step aerobics. Anyway, all of them movement and within a lot of organizations on community development and social change work. She's often my best friend.
Email to the office a letter or a citizen's complaint form.
Thank you, honey. So, Hala, I'm going to just pass it over to you, and you can jump right in.
All right, excellent. Hi, everybody. It's so nice to see you all. I'm sorry I had to Zoom in. I was hoping to be there in person, but I know that space well. I sort of know where you all are in your journey right now. I'm not going to speak too much now because I know we'll have time to talk after the class. But my intention today is to take us through an embodied practice and then maybe take some of the connections we make in the practice into our talk and into reflecting on some of the readings for today. I can't see you all that well. And so it's, going to be really important that you all take care of your bodies in any way that you need to. I mean, even if I were able to see you clearly, I would be doing my best to create a space that empowers you to reflect on what you need in your body. So I think about embodied practices as really radical practices of self-awareness and self-accountability and self-care so that we can go out and do this important work of justice work. I know some of you might be completely unfamiliar with yoga practice. Some of you might be super familiar with it. We're going to be doing movements from not just yoga, but other sort of methodologies as well. So I think we will just get started. Tessa, how's everything going technically? Is everybody able to hear me?
All good.
Okay, excellent. I'm going to make sure you all can see me. All righty, so I'm going to invite you to start by finding a comfortable seated position. And I know for some of you, sitting like this is not going to be that comfortable. If you're near a wall or a couch and you want to lean back, you can feel free to lean back. If you want to have your feet out in front of you like this, whatever feels sort of stable for you right now. And if there's anything you can do to make yourself more comfortable, if you want to kick off your shoes or adjust your clothing in any way, feel free to do that. And once you find a position that feels fairly comfortable, I want you to take a look around the room and just notice the colors and the shapes that you see. So we're doing an orienting practice now, just orienting to our environment. We're not orienting to things that feel messy or things we might want to tidy up. Just with curiosity, colors and shapes and objects. Turn your head when you do this, maybe even look at what's above you. And notice what happens in your body. Usually about half of you will take a deep breath. You might settle as your nervous system is able to orient into present time. And then once you feel sufficiently externally oriented, you can also orient with other senses, your hearing, with your touch, smell. And once you feel like you're oriented to your environment, I'm going to invite you to orient internally. So you might close your eyes, you might soften your gaze. And notice what your inner landscape is like right now. What sensations do you become aware of? What's your breathing like right now? How's the mental chatter? So again, we want to bring an attitude of curiosity to this, because the moment you get into judgment, this is good, this is bad, what's going on, we actually disconnect from what's happening. Curiosity can allow us to be present. Excuse me. And that curiosity is often what unlocks our capacity to heal. And that's really what we're going to try to practice together today for the next 20 minutes. Being in our bodies with curiosity. Sounds simple, but it's not always that easy. And then I'm going to invite you to deepen your breath. And notice if the breath feels available to you or if it feels stuck. If trying to deepen your breath feels activating or like it's stressful, don't force the breath. Just let the breath do what it wants. So again, we're just starting with a curiosity of what's present in our bodies right now. How does our nervous system react to the different instructions? You know, I love this idea that we can only begin with where we are, not where we think we should be. And for any practice to be healing, we have to be honest about where we are. I have a dear friend who uses this analogy of, say you're in Los Angeles and you want to fly to New York. You call the airline, which I know we don't do anymore because we go online, right? Or we type it in, right? And we say, hey, I need a ticket to New York. What's the first question they're going to ask? Well, where are you? And if you lie and you say, I'm in San Francisco, you're never going to get to where you want to be. We have to speak the truth of where we are if we want to get to where we want to be. So right now, just noticing what's with you, body, mind, and spirit. And take a couple more deep breaths here. All right, and then from here, if your eyes are closed, go ahead and open them. We're going to take a simple side stretch. Just bring your left hand to the floor and your right arm up. So in every position, we want to try to get really grounded. So here it means letting your sit bones get heavy in the ground. You don't want to feel like you're going to fall over. You want to get centered, feel a little bit of energy in your low belly. So we ground and we center, and then we can expand and work with our breath. I want you to notice whatever sensations emerge in your body. If you want to take that top arm back a little bit, you can. You can let the head go. And just turn the head a little bit. You might feel a stretch in your neck. If you want to reach the arm over the ear, you can. You might feel a stretch on the right side of your body. Try to send your breath to your right rib cage. One more deep breath here. And then slowly come on up. Pause when you get to the top and notice if you feel anything in the side you just stretched, right? Is there energy moving? Is there anything that settles? And then take the right hand to the floor and take your left arm up. Same thing, just try to get grounded, try to stay centered, try to stay connected to your breath. So we're going to start really simple here, y'all. Just try to stay connected to our bodies. And then moving into an inquiry about what this means in terms of how we show up in the world, how we practice liberation together. Top arm might go back. You might let the head go. Turning the head. And then if you want to reach the arm over the ear, go for it. Roll your chest open, breathing into whatever emerges. And sometimes the most uncomfortable things are the things that really need our breath and really need our attention. And in this age of so much distraction, presence is quite a radical act in the way I see it. One more breath here. And then slowly come on up. And then see what your body wants to do. There might be a movement, a spontaneous one that wants to emerge. And now we're going to actually stand up. And remember, everything that I'm inviting you to do is optional, right? If your body wants to move in a different way or express itself differently, this is your body, right? I want you to feel like you have a lot of choice here. And my other thing as a facilitator is I'm trying to create a space that's non-hierarchical, a space that's truly inclusive, right? So that means I'm attempting to empower you to make choices, right? Rather than hand your power over to me. So starting with the feet wide, let your knees bend and just let your weight shift side to side. So as we think about our body as our instrument, right? It's the instrument that we are working with in order to do our work in the world, in order to be in relationship. Part of our work as activists is the self-responsibility of understanding what we are bringing to every interaction. And the way that the larger systems live in our bodies, they live in our relationships. So embodied practices are about our own self-care, about regulating our own selves, discharging energy and trauma, expressing anger, grief, hope, and joy, all those things. Now start to bring a little bit of rhythm here as you shift side to side. You might start to move from the rib cage. You might let your shoulders move. Notice how this is for you. If you're like, oh, this is so yummy, I'm feeling really comfortable and good, or if this feels really awkward for you, if you hate it, right? There's no wrong answer. This practice is a practice of inquiry, curiosity, and presence with whatever emerges for you. And then come on back to center. And as you inhale, let your arms rise. And as you exhale, let the arms fall. 2 more of these. Just connecting your breath with movement. Letting yourself find a rhythm. And so sometimes, especially when we feel like there's no external rhythm, when we feel disconnected, we can use our practice to cultivate a sense of internal rhythm. Now just take the left arm up as you inhale and circle it around. And then switch sides, right arm up as you inhale and circle it around. Find your expression of this. Make it yours. Good, and come on back to center. And place one hand on your heart, one hand on your solar plexus. And just take a moment to check in. Each time I invite you to notice what's happening in your body, I'm inviting you to practice what we call interoception. Interoception is about our capacity to know what's happening inside of us. Interoception is a really vital part of being in healthy relationships, making good decisions, being able to collaborate, being able to think clearly and act clearly. So just a couple more breaths here. And you might notice that your mind is super distracted. I would not be surprised, and that's okay. As one of my meditation teachers said, meditation is not about keeping the mind totally still. It's about being willing to come back every time we get distracted. So just be willing to keep coming back to your body, keep coming back to your breath. All right, we're going to have a seat now. We're going to just do a couple more stretches here, and you have 2 options. You can stay seated if you prefer. All right, we're going to take a simple hamstring stretch. So if you're seated, you're just going to extend your right leg forward and bend your left knee. If you want to lay on your back, that can feel good too. So I'm going to invite you to lay on your back if that's comfortable on your back. And if you prefer to stay seated and you're near a wall, you can sit, lean against a wall for a moment. Otherwise, I'm going to invite you to come onto your backs, feet wide, knees together. Hands can be on your body or alongside your body. Eyes can be open or closed. And I want you to feel for all the places in your body making contact with the ground. And if you can look for wherever you're being supported, you might notice that your body settles. And here with your feet wide and your knees together, let your hips go side to side. And you can do this seated, right? With your feet out in front of you, letting your hips go side to side here. We're just going to do a couple more simple stretches together. All right, and come on back to center. Take your right leg up, keep the knee bent, just interlace your fingers behind your leg and just extend the leg until you're getting a stretch. And if you're seated, right, you have your left knee bent and your right leg out in front of you. You can keep your hands back or you can come forward, whatever gives you a bit of a stretch in your body. I don't want you to go so far that you feel like you're overwhelmed or overdoing it. I want you to just go to that first part of your stretch. And I want to talk about discomfort right now. So we're purposely doing something that's uncomfortable, right? And so another way to think about embodied practices is that we practice being with discomfort without getting overwhelmed, being with discomfort so that we can heal and transform it. And so we're going to try it with your hamstrings, and you can do it with systemic oppression, all right? So notice what's happening in the back of your right leg. The first thing we want to do is stay connected to something that grounds us and resources us. So can you stay connected either to your breath or feeling the earth beneath you? What is something that's a resource for you that supports you so that you can be present with whatever's uncomfortable? And so in your mind, what we're trying to do is feel your breath while you feel the sensation in the back of your right leg. Notice the discomfort, but also notice what might be supporting you. The resource can be your breath. It can be a sense of grounding. Anything that supports you. It can be something in the room. Go ahead and rotate your ankle around a few times. So really what we're doing is we're practicing being present even when things are hard. Because if we're running away from what's hard, guess what? We're going to be running away from the solution. We're going to be running away from our bodies, from our relationships. We'll be immobilized. We also want to be able to be with what's difficult without being overwhelmed. So let's just take 2 more deep breaths here. And try to be with the tension without needing it to go away, right? Sometimes acceptance is the first piece to liberate ourselves to heal. And that can be a really tough one. Now cross the right ankle over your left knee. Flex your foot and press the knee away from you. If you're getting a good stretch, then I want you to stay right here. And again, if you're seated, you can do it just like this, right? Ankle over knee. If you're not getting a stretch and you need more, you can draw the left leg in towards you. You can put your foot on the couch or wall or hold on the back of your leg. So again, I want you to find that first edge of your stretch. The other thing I want you to notice is notice your own personality. Do you tend to go in really, really deep and maybe overwhelm yourself, right? Where else do you do that? Where else do you tend to unconsciously go into overwhelm? Can you let yourself back off just a little bit? Life doesn't always give us those options, but right now in the practice, you have those options. Let's take one more breath here and then sigh it out. And then release, uncross your legs. See what your body wants to do. It might feel good to take a big stretch here. And then let's do the other side. Bend your knees. Left leg reaches up. You can hold on behind the leg and extend until you feel the stretch. So this practice is a practice of self-reflection because we get to reflect on how we show up. I always like to say that whatever habits you have on your mat, you probably have them everywhere else. Sometimes that's great news, sometimes not so much. Did you notice that you tend to be a perfectionist? Do you berate yourself? Or do you project outward and judge those around you or your teacher, perhaps? Again, no judgment on you, just stay curious. What do I learn about myself in my practice? If you want to rotate the ankle around a little bit, go ahead. And let's take a couple more deep breaths here. And then cross the left ankle over the right knee. You can stay here or draw the leg in towards you. And the other piece I want you to notice is that I'm trying to hold a space for you all that's not hierarchical, right? If you've taken typical yoga classes, sometimes teachers will say, beginners do this, intermediate, level 1, level 2, level 3, right? That's the way that we're replicating this hierarchy in our practice, that something is more advanced than the other, versus that we are all here together fumbling through trying to be embodied, and that it's messy, and that we're all human. And it's not a competition. And so I'm really curious about how we create embodied spaces that are relational rather than hierarchical. And how do we even do it simply in a movement class together? Good. Let's take one more deep breath here. Side out. And then release and uncross your legs. One last thing here, just hug your knees into your chest and rock a little bit side to side. Drop your knees over the left side. Reach your right arm out to the right. You can look in whatever direction you want. And just take a couple of breaths here. Imagine the breath washing through you. And then come on back to center and switch sides. Drop your knees over in the other direction. Left arm goes out to the left. Notice how one side might feel really different from the other. I always like to say we're all kind of lopsided. It's what makes us interesting. One more deep breath. Sigh it out. Good. Come on back to center. And let's gently make our way back up to sit. You can roll to your side and come up. Just take a moment here to pause. If closing your eyes settles you, then let your eyes close. If keeping your eyes open is settling, then please do that. And I want you to notice the impact of this short practice. Feel for anything that might be settling a little bit. Does anything feel a bit more spacious? What's your breathing like right now? Check in with if you feel grounded in this moment. And also maybe take a moment to reflect on if this practice is a mirror for you. What do you learn about yourself? What are some habits you bring into your body and the way that you relate to your own discomfort? How might this be a reflection for you of some habits you have out in the world? And again, no judgment, just a curiosity about that. And let's take 2 more full cycles of breath. Great. And then if your eyes were closed, go ahead and open them. So I want to check in with you all about that when we regroup. So we're just going to take a moment here to transition into the talk part. I know we have some people that might join us on Zoom. So try to stay connected to your bodies and maybe let this transition be without a lot of talk or chatter so we can smoothly move into the next part. Okay, and I'll let you all transition back to how you need to orient for our more official lecture part of this. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Hala. We'll be quiet. We can leave everything after this. We'll deal with it later. Just come sit down over there. We're going to turn the TV around and face that way.
Okay, Hala, whenever you're ready, we're all here.
All right, awesome. Hi, oh, and so nice to actually see you all now. I was just teaching to like a bunch of silhouettes.
We're real.
Real people, real people. And it's amazing to see some of the new furniture in the space. Oh my gosh.
It's really cute.
Yeah. So hi, everybody. So what I would love to do for this is make it a little bit conversational. So I know you were asked to read a couple chapters in what chapter in my book and a chapter in the anthology that Tess and I are working on, as well as in Tessa's book. So, but I do really want to allow our time together to also be embodied and relational and introspective. So rather than talking at you and doing a long lecture, I'm going to be, offering a few framing pieces, but really inviting us to be chewing on the material with each other, because you're going to learn a lot more about it by chewing on it with each other. But before I jump into things, I want to check in with you all about that really short practice. Just a curiosity, especially after reading some of the stuff you read, and some of you might have your own embodied practice that you do in your life. But I'm curious about your own reflections around how embodied practices are practices of self-awareness and self-reflection. Like, is there anything you noticed about yourself in a practice, like even a short practice like that, or whatever embodied practices you have? What are some of the habits that you notice that you have? Anybody want to share anything? And did you have any insights about yourself just in that short practice?
I really like what you said about not focusing on I can't remember word for word you said, but you said the meditation is not about kind of making sure you're always in that space of focus. It's about being willing to come back to that space after you find yourself kind of moving elsewhere. And I think that's a metaphor that can really apply to all of us in our semesters.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, I think that's a really important one, because I think it can feel intimidating to think I'm supposed to also have this clear mind, or I'm supposed to be enlightened, or, whatever those things are that aren't always real world goals, right? And so we think about traditions of yoga or meditation or different spiritual traditions, right? We have what we call the dualistic spiritual traditions that are kind of like the earth, the world is gross and disgusting, and we're going to practice to transcend that, right? That's not really useful as activists, right? Like as activists, we're trying to be in the world and find that sense of meaningfulness and spirituality in the messiness and in the muck of all of it, right? So we can't have this sort of sanitized perfectionistic view of what it means to be quote unquote enlightened or spiritual or whatever that is, right? That really the invitation, if we really want to be working towards justice, is to not be afraid of the mess, right? And being able to stay present in that, right? And so for me, I think that's why those connections of, can we even be present with our own sensations, much less injustice, right?
Hala, I also, something that I liked about that, I'm right here, hi there, is that it reminded me of the definition of resilience, right? So like in mindfulness, if you get distracted, it's about coming back. And in trauma, woundings happen. How do we bounce back, even though we're in the midst of the conditions? So it's not about having the challenge itself, it's about how do we react to and respond, bounce back in the moment.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And if we don't have a way of practicing that outside of the situations we're in, it's going to be really hard to do it inside of the situations we're in, right? So I think about embodied practices, whatever they are, dance, yoga, meditation, tai chi, sports, right? Whatever we are bringing that awareness to, it's like the gym, right? It's like you go to the gym and you pick up weights and you put them down, you pick them up, you put them down to make your muscles strong so that you've got in the world and like pick up the heavy objects, right? So, we try it in our practice, we cultivate that capacity when the stakes are low, so that when we're out in the world and all of a sudden it's not just my hamstring is tight and I have to be able to breathe. It's I'm facing injustice. I'm in a conflict. I'm watching somebody struggling. Now can I lean on that tool of breathing and grounding and presence so that I'm not running away from the situation, so that I'm dealing with it skillfully, right? Yes.
You had mentioned it a little bit, but like the deconstructing of hierarchy, when you talk about like how this isn't like a beginner practice, an intermediate practice, or advanced practice. This was just, I forgot what you said specifically, but it was just, there was no label on it, what we just did right now.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's, really important, because I think that so much of the work that I do in the world, and I know the orgs that you're working with are also trying to embody this, is how do we embody justice in our own bodies, in a movement class, in our nonprofits, right? Before the world is embodying it, right? We have to practice it ourselves. So even as simple, when I train movement teachers, I have them look at, are we creating hierarchy in our classes? We absolutely are. A lot of us were trained that way, right? So deconstructing that, and I like that word, deconstructing it, how it lives in our own bodies. And then for myself as a teacher, I have to deconstruct it as a facilitator, right? And detox from it in our bodies. Yeah. What else? What else did people notice, either about yourselves or the space I tried to create?
I think the idea of being like curious about the thoughts that were passing by in my head was new for me, because I've done a lot of yoga classes, especially during the pandemic, when they'd like, my YouTube instructor would be like, notice the thoughts passing by without judgment, and then just like bring yourself back to center. And that always made me feel stressed, because I don't know, it feels very judgmental and kind of like commanding of my thoughts. And then the way you framed it, I think really opened up a new mindset for me of being curious about what's going on in my body, and thinking like, how is what's going on in my body when I am, on the yoga mat, gonna maybe apply to what's going on in my head and body in class, or when I'm walking on the street, or wherever I can.
Yeah.
That was very helpful.
Great. Yeah, curiosity is only possible when we're settled, right? If we're in a fight flight state, if we're triggered, we can't be curious. We're going to be binary. This is bad. This is good, right? So curiosity is really, I think, a very lofty goal and a great guide. And I'm glad that word unlocked it for you. Because then again, like, how does that happen on the ground? Like, How can we be curious when somebody is like expressing severely racist views? Like, oh, that's so interesting that that's how you think. I'm so curious about that, right? And that the curiosity often can help us find our way towards a skillful response. This is not to judge or diminish righteous rage, anger, grief, all of the very normal and justified responses we have to injustice. So the other piece is that this perspective of embodiment is all about the both and. It's not binary. It's not like, oh my God, you sucked. You weren't curious. You got upset, right? It's you got upset. 100% understand why. Let's hold that with compassion. And when is it useful to cultivate curiosity, right? So that's the other piece we can explore in an embodied practice for ourselves, so that when we go out into more complex situations, again, we're able to hold the both and. I'm glad that felt useful to you. So maybe one more, anything else just from that practice that emerged for you? Yes.
Can you hear?
It's a little hard to hear.
Okay, I'll shout this, but I like what you mentioned about noticing if you're overstretching yourself and how that could be a sign of your personality outside of yoga as well. And I really resonated with that question, and it made me think how sometimes it's hard for me to enjoy even naturally enjoyable tasks that I do enjoy, because I just find myself trying to do my best, trying to do my hardest, trying to fully exert myself into the task, and at that point it stops being enjoyable. So I like that question when you start.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's a really important one, because you know, so much of what, you know, you all are going to be invited to do and already are in this class is this practice of self-reflection and self-accountability. How am I showing up, right? You know, and what about that is useful? What is it? What about that do I want to challenge? And how does that impact how I'm showing up in the world? So yeah. Great. Well, thank you everybody for your comments and your questions. So what I want to do now is just like take a pause, because I want to like introduce myself a little bit more officially before we dive into this material. And, you know, I just want to introduce myself in a way that models and unpacks some of the stuff we're going to talk about, right? So I'm originally from Beirut, Lebanon, and we left Beirut when I was 3 because of the war. And I always say that, you know, our traumas are usually where our gifts get born from, right? It's like the compost is where all the shit and the dirt and the gross stuff is, but that's where the beauty comes out of, right? So I think that for me, ever since I was a little girl, I've had this drive to want to see people heal their trauma so that they're not fighting with each other. Like that's become my life's purpose. And so I think my whole life I've had this thought, if I could figure out why people do what they do and I can help them heal, then we'll have peace on earth. So there's this little girl in me that just like wants to see peace in the world. And so I know that motivates a lot of the work that I do. And in my own path, it started with an interest in psychology, of like individual psychology, right? Like we just got to figure ourselves out and then everything is going to be okay, right? So I studied psychology. But what was interesting was in college, I took my first yoga class. And I took it at this gym, and you know, at the time, my physical practice was like, I was on the Stairmaster reading my textbooks, watching TV, listening to music. Like, you know, I was not in my body. I was just like trying to burn calories because I just like binged on a dozen donuts the night before or something like that, right? My exercise was not an embodied practice. It was basically a punishment, right? And I remember seeing this yoga teacher, and she was wearing like baggy pants and a baggy shirt. This wasn't like a power yoga, fitnessy type of yoga class. And there was something about her that was like really drew me. And I went into the yoga class, and it was this really slow, meditative class. I hated it. Like it made my skin crawl because I couldn't be so still. But I remember looking at this teacher and thinking, I don't know what that is, but I want that. Now I look back and the teacher to me represented somebody who was like super grounded, like that was not anxious. She was really self-regulated. That's a term that I use in my work a lot, right? And I wasn't. I was anxious. I was frazzled. I was never present in my body, right? I don't know if any of you resonate with that, right? The stress of college, right? And I didn't even have a word for what she embodied, but I knew that would be a good thing to experience, and that yoga might help me get there. But then I didn't go back to yoga for years because I wasn't really ready to get into my body in that way. I needed to be moving and moving and moving. And I share that because I think about embodied practices as really anything that helps us be in our bodies. So I could be doing yoga and not be in my body, right? I can be in yoga and just be thinking about having a flat stomach or whatever. Like, I can bring all my stuff to any physical practice. Or I can be in a fitness class and be thinking about like celebrating my body and, connecting to my breath and healing. So when I talk about embodied practices, I'm talking about anything that we do that helps us be in our bodies in a healthy, healing way. And so my own life, that was a really big part of my journey. And so I spent years studying psychology, teaching yoga in private practice, working with people one-on-one. And, there was a point, in my clinical training where I got invited to come teach yoga to incarcerated youth. And I went to Central Juvenile Hall here in Los Angeles and taught at the girls' ward. And brought a lot of my training in trauma healing into this space. And part of what I really reflected on as we were doing this amazing healing work was the ways that these young girls were inside systems of trauma, right? That these were all mostly Black and brown girls. And at the time they were incarcerated on prostitution charges. So these girls are being sexually trafficked and then criminalized for their abuse, basically. And I really had to reflect on what's the place of these embodied practices inside systems that are so violent, right? If I am saying to these young girls, well, just breathe and ground and like, then you can settle your nervous system, but I'm not addressing the systems that they're inside of, then I become part of the problem, right? I'm asking people to regulate inside of systems of oppression, right? Then do I become an agent of that oppression? And I think about that a lot, especially having spent years teaching yoga on the west side of Los Angeles, right? So like if I'm having, wealthy white people or people in dominant culture do a practice that's healing without holding them accountable for the ways they're complicit in these larger systems, then I become part of that problem, right? So I'm really interested. Oh, I'm kind of introducing myself and the work. And then, I went and I got a master's degree in community psychology to really think about how do we practice well-being together? And how does embodiment fit into that? How does embodiment fit into that? So my path has really taken me on this journey from what I call individual well-being into collective care. And I tried for years to believe that if I could just be well, I did a lot of therapy and I ate really healthy and I dealt with my shit, then I could be free, right? But I can't because I'm part of this larger world. And these systems that harm so many and privilege the few impact all of us, even if we're privileged by these systems. And so I've become really interested, and a lot of this has been impacted in my friendship with Tessa and my work with Tessa over the years, right? I was the like yoga healing trauma person, and she was the social justice activist person, and our work has always melded together and co-inspired each other. So I'm really interested in what it means to build beloved community together, the role of embodiment in that, and how we can skillfully center embodiment without falling prey to individualism. And I think that can be tough, as it can be a fine line, right? So I think that's all I want to say in terms of like locating myself in this work. And so what I want to do is transition us a little bit more now into, And I just want to acknowledge the folks that are here on the Zoom. Hi, Zoom people. Zoom no longer shows me the empty boxes when people aren't on screen. So sometimes I don't even get to see that there's people with me, but I just want to acknowledge just a couple people here with us. So what I want to do is talk to you all about what it means to center healing in our activism and social justice work. What does it mean to center healing in our activism and social justice work? And healing in a way that is really meaningful, that isn't like a platitude, that is not a bypass. Because I have been in touch with certain communities that can either use this idea of healing or oneness or even spirituality to bypass or try to circumvent the truth of the world, the truth that oppression exists and there's so many people that are being harmed by these systems. And most of us are in some way, shape, or form complicit inside of these systems, and that can be really heartbreaking, right? And then I've seen activist communities throw all that away, like just be dedicated to the fight and find anything that is healing to be too soft, a distraction, right? Or it's not a place. And I know Tessa often talks about how in her own work, she had these really deep healing practices and her dance and her spirituality, and then she had her activism, right? And so much of her work and her writing has been about how we bring the two together skillfully. And so what does it mean to center healing in our activism? And I want to start by that this means by really defining healing in a way that is nuanced and complex, not a really simple definition, but that healing and the way I understand it is that it has to be embodied, it has to be relational, and it has to be critical. And I'm going to break that down, and then I want to hear your thoughts about that, right? It has to be embodied, relational, and critical. So when we talk about healing, and at any point, please, if y'all have questions or comments, raise your hands, okay? I'd love to hear from you, and I will take pauses as well. But when I talk about healing being embodied, I mean that healing has to literally impact our brain and our nervous system such that we are building new neural patterns of being, that we are healing trauma and digesting and metabolizing our trauma in a way that allows us to be more integrated and whole. We know that unhealed trauma lives in the body in a particular way. It's stored in the brain in a way that is connected to the amygdala and to the stress centers. We know that it impacts our ability to regulate our nervous systems. We also know that when we heal trauma, our brains change and our nervous systems change. So I don't know about you all, but I know y'all are young, so you still have a lot of your journey ahead of you. But there were times in my own healing journey where I thought I'd healed something because I did some superficial work around it, like, oh, I just changed my thoughts and I said this positive affirmation and now I'm healed because I'm just saying, I love myself, and I would have these sort of superficial, like quick fix versions of healing. I was obsessed with healing workshops, y'all. Like I used to, like even in 8th grade, leave school to go to the bookstore to read self-help books. I was a little bit of a self-help junkie. And so always going to workshops on healing, always trying to figure out how to fix myself. If I could find a guru or a pill or a chant or a practice to heal, I signed up for all of that stuff, y'all, all of it. And all of it I would think it would work in a moment because you'd get sort of high off of the workshop or the insight. And then a week later, I was like back to my same old stressed out, neurotic, self-hating self, right? Because none of those methodologies were actually changing me from the inside out. They were just a little bit more like ideas, and they didn't get to the depth of what healing is. So when we really think critically about what healing is and what it isn't, then healing can be used and worked in the service of justice, in the service of justice. And embodiment is one of the foundational practices that we can utilize. I'm going to give you an example. I'm going to give you a few examples, right? So I've had folks come to me. I remember when somebody came to me because like their partner thought they needed therapy and they were like, I'm fine. Like, I don't have any issues. Like, I don't even know what to talk about. Like, I'm fine. And so I spent a bit of time just kind of getting them into their bodies. What do you feel in your body? When I ask you this question, what do you feel like? At one point I said, like, how do you feel in your relationship? They were like, I'm great. I love my partner. And then I said, okay, let's just pause and tell me what you feel in your heart. And I just got really quiet and I had them just stay in their bodies. And within 2 minutes, the person was sobbing, right? And all of a sudden they connected to something deeper that was going on for them. And the real work started when I could circumvent the mental defenses and get to what was happening beneath it. So part of what I'm really curious about, part of the work that Tess and I are really doing together is how do we bring that awareness into our collaborations, right? How are we able to say, I'm working with this person and on paper, I think they're really great, but every time I see them, I get a knot in my stomach and I just have this negative feeling, right? Well, how am I going to check in with that? What is that feeling in my body? Because that's going to be impacting how I'm interacting with this person. Is this feeling in my body my internalized bias about this person? Is this feeling in my body actually an intuition that I need to listen to, right? We want to be aware of those signals in our body because they impact how we act and how we behave. But sometimes we want to be in denial about them. So I want to pause for a moment because I feel like I just said a lot. It was a little bit jumbled, but I'm curious, in your own sort of seeking of healing, do you have any of your own connections around things that you've done that you thought were healing, but when you look back, you're like, oh, that was sort of disembodied and it didn't really last, or things that you've done that have felt more embodied, that have felt like they've been more impactful? I'm just curious about your own understanding of this, just based on your own life experience so far. Yes.
I feel like I've experienced like types of like things that you were kind of touching on, like workshops or like reading things or doing certain yoga classes where it is for the purpose of healing, but in a very like goal oriented way. And it's very much like you're gonna do this and it's gonna get you here. And it's like this whole thing is just to like reach this goal. And I feel like, at least for me, like recently, I've just kind of been thinking about how it's like I'm not actually trying to get anywhere. Like I'm like want to take part in these practices to like continue to center myself and continue to heal. And maybe like healing is not like a thing that ever really happens, but it's like a process that's kind of like ongoing.
Yeah. I love that. I feel like what you're pointing to is this sort of aspirational healing, right? It's like aspirational marketing, right? Like work out and you'll look like this. And it's this goal over there, right? Versus like real healing is really messy. It's awkward. It's slow, right? It's like adolescence all over again. And that when we really are truly changing patterns from unhealthy ones to healthy ones, we have to go through a very awkward stage of change and transformation. So anything where you go from, I was feeling really awkward to now I feel really amazing, right? Well, if we're skipping the awkward stages, right, then it's not going to last. It might be a beautiful insight. Like, I don't want to also poo-poo inspiration, like times where we felt really inspired, we sort of have a window into what's possible. The thing is, anybody who's like a really skillful healer will say to you, hey, y'all, it's often going to get a little worse before it gets better, because anytime we change patterns, it's uncomfortable, right? If it weren't, everybody would be healing very easily, right? And so that nuanced view, I always used to joke with my students of like, I'll never be able to start a cult because I'm not selling anything that's like, hey, like, take my class and la, 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 right? It's like, take my class and then you'll feel super awkward for a while as you're transforming. And then things will feel subtly different and your life will be different, right? That like real healing is not so sensationalistic. But capitalism, right? The commodification of healing, the extraction of healing methods from indigenous, cosmologies and methodologies, right? Have sort of given us this more sanitized, extractive form of healing, which is a little bit more of it's a little bit more performative, not as depthful, right? But when we can reframe it together in our collectives, then we can foster a really, substantive version of what healing is. And when we do that, I think we can apply it more towards our social justice movements, towards organizing, and towards, the work that we are doing. And the other piece about it is that the relational piece, right? The relational piece that, I used to say about yoga, I have this quote I like to say, which is, your yoga's working, not when your yoga poses get better, but when your relationships get better, right? Whatever practice we're doing, if it improves our relationships, then it's working, right? Healing is relational. We are relational beings. There's a really great Buddhist teacher, Jack Kornfield, who spent years in the Himalayas and achieved enlightenment supposedly, right? And he was like, it was bliss, right? Then he like went back home to New York City and he was like so neurotic and like hated his mother and couldn't deal with traffic, right? And he wrote this really great book called After the Ecstasy, the Laundry. It's like, okay, if you can't be happy doing laundry, then you're not enlightened, sorry, right? Anybody can be happy sitting on a mountaintop away from all of society. But who are we when we're dealing with our like parents or the person we can't stand, right? What's the other quote I love is like, you think you're enlightened, go spend a week with your family, right? So this idea of relational healing, I see the smiles, I know, and especially at your age, it was particularly tough for me. I remember I'd be at school, I'd be like, I'm awesome. Then I'd go back home and I'd be like, I'm 12 years old again. And like, nothing's changed, right? Going home always gave me a little litmus test of the work I had to do on myself, right? And I figured enlightenment would be when I could be home and just be loving and open. That's the final frontier, y'all. That's the final frontier, right? Family. But healing is relational. And when we think about our activism, right? How many of us, and I know I've been guilty of this, like I'm really mad about like oppression out there and the way these systems oppress everybody, yet I'm judging, I'm separating, I'm subtly wanting to have power over people, right? I'm trying to figure out my own little nonprofit how to be equitable, right? And so, Adrienne Marie Brown is constantly saying to us, how dare we ask people to do it out there if we can't even do it inside of our organizations, right? But we can't do it if we're not connected to our own sensations. It's really that simple. If we're not connected to our own sensations, then we can't know when we're triggered, when we're judging, when our biases are coming up, because we can pretend like we're fine. We could pretend like it's not happening. So this practice of being in our bodies, again, allows us to hold ourselves accountable. It then allows us to be in our relationships and be really honest, like, oof, my dynamic with this person, even though on paper I can say I've been fair, I've been this, I've been that, I'm actually not feeling that way. I'm not actually in relationship in that way, right? And when I've gone into organizations and invited folks to reflect on our own internalized biases, what I have found, and I know this has been across the board with others doing similar work, is the people that do not have a practice of being with discomfort cannot skillfully confront their own internalized racism and sexism and homophobia, et cetera, et cetera. So we have to know how to be skillfully with discomfort if we're going to disrupt and dismantle our participation in systems of oppression. And so we have to have a practice in order to do that. And then how do we build that practice into our cultures with each other, whether it's a classroom culture, which is what you all are doing there, a nonprofit culture, right? So that we can be really honest and explicit with each other and go, gosh, you know what, I'm noticing I have certain assumptions about this person, or I'm noticing this is showing up in our organization. How do we pause and look at how we shift that? And this is where that third piece of how we define healing, embodied, relational, and critical. So critical refers to critical consciousness. I want to point to the work of Hala Khouri, who talked about conscientización, right? This process of understanding the socio-political context that we are in, our own social location, our own place within those larger systems. So that our reflection has to include that. It has to include that. I remember many, many years ago, this was over 20 years ago, I sat on the board of an organization that brought hip hop and spoken word to system-involved youth. And on the board was a woman who was system impacted, had a child at age 14, was incarcerated for about 20 years, right? Came out and this became her life's work, right? And I remember it one day after a board meeting, she came up to me and she was pissed. She just said, you know what, Hala, you think you're better than me. You have a college degree and you think you're all, she was so mad at me. And at the time, I was so surprised because she was somebody I really looked up to. I thought she was such a badass. Like she'd had this life experience and like, who am I? This like privileged person, never had that lived experience, right? I really thought I experienced her as a badass, right? But when she came to me with that feedback, the first thing I had to do was just pause and go, okay, before I start to defend and say, no, I think you're amazing. I'm not judging you. I had to really get curious about what I just represent as a white presenting person, right? As a person with a college education. It doesn't even matter what my internal environment is. She's going to experience me a particular way because of what I represent to her nervous system. And I had to just pause and acknowledge that I represent something regardless of the truth of who I am, right? And then I had to go, well, do I have some of that? I got to dig a little deeper, right? I had to dig a little deeper. So even though I fancied myself thinking she was badass, right? I had to get curious. Is there a way where I might think I'm smarter, right? I have more education. You know, and I always like to say to people, if you are not periodically absolutely cringing at yourself, you are not doing this work. It's embarrassing, y'all. And regardless of your own identity, we all have different work to do, right? So, you know, we all are impacted by these systems differently. So I don't want to have these sort of platitudes, right? We all have slightly different work to do, but I do want to say that even if you come from a lived experience of marginalization in our society, then your work is your own internalized oppression, right? We all carry biases around other people in different ways, yet we all have different levels of power inside of these systems, and that impacts our responsibility, right? But none of us are exempt from the work. And this is really important because part of what we risk happening inside of our movements is a replication of these systems, but with different people holding the power. I want to point to the Kazuhaga quote that I start my chapter with, and he says, we can bring down the entire system and have a worldwide revolution. But if we haven't healed our traumas and learned how to be in authentic relationships with each other, we will corrupt any new system that we put in its place. And I think it's really important that we're all listening to that and then understanding, what does it mean to move from systems of domination and hierarchy to systems of collective liberation? We're not going to go from one directly to the next. And what skill does it take to be inside the awkwardness of transformation together? So I want to pause for a moment. Yes, I see a hand.
Hi, sorry. Yeah, I had a question about that because I feel like for me, like there's this tension between that idea of like wanting to center healing so that we're not replicating these like power imbalances and systems, but also like when you think about that and what we were just talking about before, the idea of like healing not being like a step you can reach and then you're healed. It's like a constant process. And I would love to hear your thoughts on like how those both can be true.
Right. Like how we're like, it's not like, check, we're healed. Now let's go do the liberation work, right?
Yeah.
That healing, it like that healing, this healing centered is an attitude. It's an approach. Maybe it's even, we could even maybe say it's a methodology, right? It's a way of being versus a goal, right? And I think that that's where the complexity, the both and of, you know, in the work that we're doing, getting really clear of what does healing look like? Like, and again, you know, sometimes there's conflict and the conflict is an indication of something wrong, right? There's conflict because people don't have a voice or there's this person is misusing their power, right? But sometimes there's conflict because people are uncomfortable because things are changing. And when we don't know how to sit with discomfort, we might then need to make other people wrong and bad. So the healing-centered paradigm asks us to get curious about discomfort and conflict so that we can, as skillfully as possible, make a determination. Is this a conflict that's telling us something is occurring that has to be changed or pulled back? Or is this a conflict that is indication of growth? I want to try to give you all some examples, but if any of you have examples, or Tessa, you have some, I know I have one, but I know these are sort of conceptual. Anybody have just examples of those? Not that you have the answer to it, but situations you've been in or witnessed where that question might be useful. All right, I have an example if nobody else does. Okay. So, and I don't know if conflict is the right word, but discomfort. So I had a small nonprofit off the mat to the world, and we did our best to have a multi-identity staff and find a way to collaborate in the nonprofit that allowed everybody to be present in the fullness of the difference of their differences, right? Honoring their differences while trying to move towards goals. Like we had goals, we had, you know, money to raise and programs to run. And there was a lot of conflict because when you get people together that have a lot of different lived experiences, it's just not going to run as smoothly. It really isn't, right? Because we're going to bump into each other a lot more. So, you know, we had like 4 people on staff. We had, you know, a neurotypical able-bodied Black queer woman. We had the neurodivergent, chronically ill, autistic, queer, non-binary person. We had the Middle Eastern, cis, straight, hetero woman, and then me, right? So like lots of different identities. And so on one level, what was great was folks could pick up on stuff. So the Black woman, the queer woman could like pick up on when there was like racism happening or, you know, heterosexism, and the neurodivergent person could, and the disabled person could notice when there was disability stuff. So people's nervous systems would get kicked up when things were out of alignment, which was always a gift, right? But at the time, it would look like they would get upset, or there'd be conflict, or they'd be mad at us for doing it wrong, right? So part of the work of the organization was to say, you know, to create a lot of space for feedback from people that were impacted by the issues we were trying to address. And rather than framing as this is a conflict or this is a fight, saying, no, tell us more, bring it in. This is important information that we need. And then do the care work for people that were having to do all this emotional labor, right? To educate us. These are people that were on staff. They were also being paid for this, right? And we had, so it was super, super messy. But when I look back, the messiness was an indication of us growing our capacity and our integrity. Does that make sense?
Mhm.
But then we'd have to make some distinctions, because then sometimes someone would come and say, I'm actually being harmed now because my needs aren't being met. So I think my answer is a little bit messy, because the answer is just a messy one of not always framing discomfort as harm, not always framing discomfort as conflict, but also not being afraid of conflict or shying away from it. So again, we come back to this idea of our relationship to discomfort. Remember when you're in that hamstring stretch, right? If we understand that this process is uncomfortable, if we allow it to include discomfort, then we can be discerning about when is the discomfort something that actually is really important to listen to, because it's an indicator of things that have to change. And how are we going to skillfully attend to it? I don't know if that answered your question, but it's sort of a messy answer, because when we center healing, it's not all rainbows and lollipops and incense and candles, right? It is about beautiful healing practices that also, however, create space for joy and celebration to coexist with the discomfort and the messiness. That's the ideal, y'all, is like it's super messy, and then we're able to take a breath and celebrate each other. That we're able to move in and out, in and out.
Can I interject something, Hala?
Please,
I
please.
also want to say the multiple ways in which healing can occur. So we did a lot of work, Hala and Scarlett and I, and a few CASA students started a program called No Justice, No Peace. And we worked with all of the CASA partners and did interviews and focus groups with all the staff and said, where does stress and conflict and trauma come up in the work that you're trying to do for social justice? And what tools do you have, and what more do you need, or what do you want? We have fascinating conversations with all the organizations you're looking at. And then we heard from people what they wanted and needed, and we tried to create some tools and workshops and trainings that would offer the skills and ideas that people were asking for. So we did an 8-month-long training where it was twice a month, and folks came together and learned from a variety of different people. So many of whom are in your syllabus, these skills for healing justice. And when we talked to people about how they actually, at the end of it, everyone who was involved created sort of a plan of how they were going to integrate this back into their organization. And for a lot of folks, the healing in the organization was like, let's bring food to staff meetings and spend the first 20 minutes just breaking bread and asking each other about our lives. Right, so I just also wanted, like, the healing is also community building work that just makes people feel like they have a sense of belonging, connection, safety, love, so that when the harder shit comes up, you have more bandwidth, because you're like, oh, that's Josh, and I know he didn't need to be a jerk when he said that thing to me, because I know him. So let me get curious and be like, hey, Josh, when you said that, that didn't land right. And then he can hear and be like, oh, I know she's not just some uptight, whatever, I'm gonna like listen to what she has to say, right? Because we have created a bit of a relationship. So I think the healing, just as much as Hal was saying, it has to be relational, and that can look many different ways. And so, you know, same thing with Scarlett always gives this great example of how to bring healing into like direct action. And she was at a direct action that was with issues of immigration, and cops were showing up, and the stress was really intense, and people were feeling very anxious and scared. And she was like, let's start a chant, right? And so they started doing a chant, like a protest chant. But do you know what you're doing? You're chanting, you're breathing, you're getting in unison in song with each other. That actually does something biochemistry in your brain and in your body to get in each other's rhythm. right? When you have a newborn baby and they're crying and crying, crying, I always say, take off your shirt, take off their shirt, open to your chest. Because skin to skin, they feel your heartbeat and they automatically start regulating their nervous system, right? So we're all just those babies running around. So we do these little things, right? To like sing together, breathe together, chant, talk together, like something to find a way to get the stress out and regulate a little bit. So the healing itself might look like breathing on your mat. And that, I think, is what Hala was saying, like we have to have a practice that we do ourselves to get us in the practice of learning how to come back to a regulated place. So that when we're in the harder places where the stakes are higher, she said, we have some tools that have been sharpened. We're not just like all of a sudden in this really high stress situation, conflict, and like expecting ourselves to be magnificently like calm and like I'm going to navigate this conflict with tons of skill without having practice, right? So it's the practice beforehand and then building those practices into organizations so they can weather the storms that are going to come up left and right. And also the reason why the practice is important outside the organization is because the organization is actually not the place where I'm probably going to do trauma healing work that I need to do on my ship and leading to the table. So we have a staff meeting to do, and we have like so many projects to do, and there's some work to get through. And it gets a little messy when people are working out all their stuff in the middle of a staff meeting or the middle of the class, or you know what I mean? It's like we have to be dedicated to do that work outside and inside and know when it's the right place for each thing, which is a nuance that sometimes people can't always figure out, and that's why we have each other doing it together. This Hala could say to me, "Ooh, that sounds really intense. Why don't you and I do a one-on-one afterwards to talk about this, but not do it right in the middle of the staff meeting, right? Or what support? Maybe you just need a day off so you can do your stuff and not be expected to show up and do the work right now. But when you come, we need to be doing this work or whatever. You know, there's ways to negotiate how to the appropriate places for all of that."
Mm. Thank you, Tessa. That's great. And there's a few things you said that I want to amplify. So one is when we can build up a positive reserve of relationality, then that lets us cushion when there's conflict, when there's misunderstanding, when there's just so much stress and we're unskillful, right? But when there's no relationship there, it's just boom, it just lands, you know, it's terrible. It's so funny. I've been reflecting on it a lot. This is a funny example, but like with my neighbors, I have neighbors on one side of me that just, I think that they believe the world is a terrible place and everybody around them should be punished for their existence. That's my experience of my neighbors, right? And then my other neighbors were all good friends. We've all made an effort to really get to know each other. My dog loves to hang out in the front yard, which means that sometimes he goes and he poops on the neighbor's yards. I'm very vigilant about it, but I often miss it. So my neighbor that I'm in a relationship with, she'll just send me a poop emoji and a heart. Bam, I go pick it up, right? The neighbor like just decided they hate me. They pick up the poop and they leave it in front of my front door. It's a very stressful, and it gets me so upset, you know, because I've tried to build relationships. You know, the guy doesn't speak English. He's Italian. I once even used Google Translate, got him a basket with wine and chocolate, a whole note, you know, but they're not interested in relationships. So now I'm just the annoying neighbor whose dog poops in their yard. There's no other part to our relationship. So I'm terrified about my dog pooping in their yard, right? But my other relationship uses my other neighbor uses my Peloton and I know her kids and we, you know, so I can make a mistake and it's like poop emoji with a heart, right? It's because there's relationship, right? But in the other one, there's no relationship. So you think about it, people we're working with, especially high stress situations, right? Where there's constantly going to be crisis or trauma, you know, I mean, this is in your friendships or in your romantic relationships, like y'all are young for this, but like marriage, like, you know, marriages fall apart if all you do is the hard work of like raising the kids and paying the bills and you got to go on a date night, right? So you got to go on a date night, right? So how are we creating a positive reserve of connectivity that creates a buffer for conflict, difficulty, stress, and trauma? And that's stuff like bringing people meals, doing a check-in, right? We build into our cultures opportunities for low stakes connection with proper boundaries. And Tessa, I'm so glad you uplifted this because so often organizations are like, well, if we ask people how they're doing, this becomes group therapy. There's a fear that the more we allow it to be relational, that it can become enmeshed, codependent, the boundaries get blurry. So really important what Tessa said, we do a lot of our work outside the organizations, right? And how do we build connection inside the organization with an understanding that part of that is our own self-care and self-accountability we're doing when we're not there, right? But we need this buffer zone of connection to handle conflict. The other thing I want to uplift that you said, Tessa, is this idea of flexibility. So the buffer zone gives us flexibility to go from, oh, that really triggered me what you just said, but I can actually, I have enough bandwidth to speak to you about it. But also sometimes inside of organizations, when we pull back, we are both attending to harm. So food justice work, right? We're trying to get food to folks, right? Trying to deal with the policies that are making food access a problem. So we have to be sort of in like a fight mode, right? But we also want to be able to be settled enough to create a vision of what food justice looks like, right? We cannot be creative when we are in fight mode and battle mode. So these practices also allow us to move swiftly from, all right, I got to turn right now and write the grant, or, I've got to deal with like putting out a fire, right? And now I'm going to get to a meeting that's about visioning and creativity. I'm going to settle enough to be visioning, right? We cannot vision, we cannot dream what we want when we are inside of a trauma response, right? So it's also about the flexibility, because sometimes we have to use our energy differently. Sometimes we're in crisis mode, but what often happens is we get stuck in crisis mode, especially in organizations that are dealing with crisis all the time, right? It's really, really normal.
And you're addicted to it.
And we get addicted to it. Yeah.
Stress has an addictive quality. So people who always have drama and always are stressed, it's not always external forces. There's some internal codependence on that, like, you're not sleeping, you're going, it's hard. And like, there's some addiction to that. And to actually sit down enough and feel the sorrow in your heart, or how exhausted you are, or what's really going on, feels like a liability. So it's much better to go fast and hard, even if it means you're in conflict. And that's really why that self-awareness is like, ooh, there's a lot of hard stuff out there, but am I making it part of myself too? Am I complicit in it as well?
And the addiction is partly because to go from stress and trauma to being settled and creative again requires this melting process that's really uncomfortable. It means, like Tessa said, confronting your your rage, your grief, your helplessness, confronting that for a lot of us, our desire to see change happen is because of our own traumas where we didn't have those needs met. And so we feel very mobilized. And there's a fear that if we're not constantly vigilant or doing, something bad could really happen, right? So how do we have a lot of compassion for that? And notice the ways that even if 10% of it is our own addiction to stress and 90% of it is that there's so much stress, how do we handle whatever percentage that we're bringing to it unnecessarily, right? In Buddhism, there's this saying that there's enough necessary suffering. We don't want to add unnecessary suffering on top of it, right? So we use our practice to shave that away. And that has to be built in to the organizational structure and the organizational culture. And I want to, and Tessa, tell me if this is a good inquiry, but I feel like at the stage of where you all are at in your internships, but I'm curious if at this point in your internships, there have been ways that the culture building aspect has been made explicit. Like I know in some of your internships, there's a real explicit, like, we do check-ins. This is how we value self-care. And in others, there might still be a sense of urgency where you're not seeing it yet. I know some of the sites you're at are really skillful at front loading that stuff. Others are not going to be as skillful. So I'm inclined to let you all, Tessa, what do you think this is a good question for them at this point, is to do a little bit of like parent share around, are you seeing the ways that this healing paradigm is embedded in the organizations you're working in already? Are you seeing it? Are you not seeing it? If so, how? Does that feel useful at this point? Yeah. I know you're more tapped into where folks are in their process.
Sure. I think it's also good, even if they don't see it, they've still had exposure for weeks already. So I think that's what is there or isn't is a telling thing.
Yeah. So I think what I want to do is invite you into just like pairing up with somebody so that again, as you are in your internships, you're getting curious about how is culture being set here? How might I more skillfully learn about the culture, right? Because, you know, a big part of the beginning stages of your internships is, again, sometimes you have to be super proactive, right? To be able to like have people's attention and get present at events that might connect you with the communities, right? So I think the reflection I want to invite you to have, and Tessa, feel free to add on to this, is like, are you seeing evidence of a healing centered environment so far in your internships? If so, what does that look like, right? How is it showing up? Is it explicit? Is it just relational? Is it in how you're feeling, right? Or is it feeling like it's missing so far? And if so, what are the indicators of that? Tessa, does that feel like a useful question, or is there anything you want to add to that?
Sounds great. Maybe just type it in the chat too, so people can see it. They get, forget the prompt.
Yes, I will type it into the chat. And so what I will say is like, let's do a pair and share for maybe like 6 minutes. So you can just hear from each other. And I know sometimes you might be pairing with somebody that's in your internship, same one, or somebody that's in a different one. But I want to just hear you sort of actively chewing on this as it applies to your internship right now. Does that sound clear to everybody? Yeah. Okay. I will type it into the chat as well.
Person next to you. So, yeah, you two, middle two, and then end it.
Together, just a lot of their like physical wellness, like physical activity is really important. Like the rate of like diabetes
Just because it's
so
so
we've been invited
it's in a hard time.
well. They also do. But I know that, we come from the generation where it's like,
Yeah.
but like, it's not so different. So like, that's what we're about
I'm so.
Actually, yeah, for art walk.
I remember what I thought about and I look at it right now, and like, literally, how do I think yeah. But it's also like, and I feel like a lot of people that I struggle with thinking about like hearing people talk about like wanting to lose weight, it's like it is like medically covered for a lot of people, and there's like such a difference between exactly that I think gets like overcross. And it's like so hard to like lose some weight, like get people to actually like lower the risk of heart disease. Absolutely, that's a really useful program. Like having a program set up, like trying not to like do so hard.
I think they're doing a good job because I think it's like so it's only like the older members of the community who like feel like need to lose weight. That would like younger people But I don't know, because I haven't, she said like they have like a little board set up, and people talk about right down where she said, so I haven't seen the board, I don't know how it's presented. But from what, like, the conversations that we have, like, it seems like not.
I really just did.
I feel like the like. more social relations. Yeah, but I'm gonna go. So they did have.
Hi, honey. It's going great. I just sent you a message about the last 10 minutes.
Oh, did you text it to me?
Yeah,
There we go.
and we can wrap up here in the next 2 minutes.
Perfect. Yeah, that sounds perfect.
Okay.
Can you hear me or should I text you back?
Text, I think.
We had a conversation. They still need people that. And we're very.
One more minute, all.
Not in one field, that was like the, either the looming presence at the right corner or nowhere, and nowhere. So
I think I'm.
it does for the looming presence.
You ready, Hala?
Mm-hmm.
All right. All right, everyone. Come on back. We've got 10 minutes left.
All right, welcome back. Just before we go to the last bit, like any highlights from that, anything that you want to share that was interesting, any insights when you thought about your internships in this way, or any examples you want to give? No, okay. So, I want to invite you to just keep reflecting on this as you move through your internship, because I do know, several of the internship liaisons, they're really explicit about this. And I think that some of the sites you're at are really trying to be very explicit about creating a healing centered culture, right? Others might be struggling more with it, or there might be individuals from within that are sort of more skillful or, more of an understanding or more able to translate the work. The other piece about this culture building is it has to be made explicit all the time, because dominant culture will always take hold, right? It'll always take hold. And so when we're inside of organizations trying to build sort of a counterculture, we have to name it. We have to be explicit about it. We have to tell other people constantly what we're trying to do, right? And especially as new folks come in. So I want to spend the last 10 minutes just checking in with you all about the book chapter that Tesha shared for you from the anthology we're working on. And so Tessa told me she hasn't shared with you about this anthology yet, but that, Tessa brought me on to support her in bringing together a cohort of folks to work on an anthology on healing justice, based on this, the No Justice, No Peace series that we did, where we really got feedback from folks inside of these organizations around what was going on for them, what practices they needed. And so we're trying to create this anthology that can be almost like a manual to support people, organizers, activists, people working inside of community-based organizations to build these healing-centered organizations. And so my chapter is the second chapter with titled The Trauma of Injustice, Understanding Trauma and Fostering Healing and Movement Work. And I just wanted to spend the last 10 minutes seeing how this landed for you all, right? And, you know, thinking about like, you know, do you think that work like this would be important for the general public or people in other organizations that might not have access to a class like this, right? You know, maybe you can think about other internships you've had or other organizations that you've been a part of. I know that Tessa told me that some of you here also have started your own organizations already, right? So thinking about how we might support organizations to build these healing-centered cultures. So, you know, were there any takeaways that you had from this chapter in particular, or even feedback around like, oh, you know, how do you think this would land for folks, or what do you think folks need to support them to build healing justice organizations?
Oh, just say it. Sorry, I don't know if you saw my hand.
Oh, no, I didn't see you. No.
Just towards the end of our conversation, that I think is not something that's like generally widespread yet, is this idea that healing can occur in many different ways that like already seem kind of intuitive, but doing them intentionally. And I was even talking to Elsie about this during when we were like on the road earlier. Just about being intentional in relationship building, even with those who are very close to you already. I think that can be a form of healing and like continuing to create community, like how we talked about healing. It's this never-ending process. And it's like, okay, I have this close friend. I'm not going to neglect that relationship just because they're already close. And I'm going to continue building this relationship, like hypothetically, even though that feels very intuitive and that feels very obvious. I think it's a really important tool that, like, I personally, until this morning, I've really been thinking about. So.
Yeah, I love that. Like making it explicit, like I'm prioritizing relationship, right? I'm putting energy into this. And I do think it's important to make it explicit. So I love that. And that can amplify our motivation too, especially because again, dominant culture will take us away from that if we're not careful. So we really want to name it. I remember there was a time where I was like, I need to prioritize relationship. And I have these virtual sticky notes on my computer filled with all these to-dos. And I created a giant one that said, prioritize your relationships. And I was like, I need to remember to not let the to-do lists, right, take over. Of course, it got covered with to-do lists. I'll be quite honest with you, but do try to remember that, right? And we have to keep making it explicit. Thank you for that.
I would also add on to that, Adrienne Maree Brown has this practice called working on excellence. She calls it working on excellence. And you have a circle of rows. So there's like a circle of close people who can keep you accountable. And you're like, I'm really trying to develop my skills in restorative or in being aware of my heterosexism or racism or whatever it is, or my own healing or how I come at people. And they are there to help keep you accountable and in line. And Hala and I are roles, we work on excellence in our work all the time. We come to each other, I'm dealing with this thing, I'm not sure if I'm doing it right, or, you know, to really be vulnerable with, so they can be already baseline relationships that we explicitly put an intentional ask to each other. Hey, do you want to really like work on some hard stuff together and be vulnerable in that way? I have it with Hala, I have it with Jacoby. There's a couple people in my life who I can count on, and then they'll call me lovingly in if I'm kind of wavering on what I want, the alignment of my values and my actions. So.
Yeah. And I think being explicit about building those relationships, right? And saying, this is what I need from you, you know? I remember when Tessa, you sent me a chapter of one of your books, and I was like, I just want to tell you how amazing it is, but I'm going to read it again so I can give you some actual critique. Like I'm going to force myself to dig a little deeper to see what else I can share, not just the celebration of you, but can I really use my skill to hold you accountable, right? Even though my impulse is just wants to do the positive, again, we have this really strong agreement with each other that we are really here to also do that other piece, right? But we have to keep making it explicit. Yeah. What else? Any other like thoughts or reflections? Yes.
I guess one thing that I really appreciated was your discussion like pretty early on of like kind of what trauma is. And it helped me like really understand that like trauma is like the physiological response and not just like the event, that like one event might affect people really, really differently. And they might have different like traumatic experiences after it. And I feel like that was really helpful in clarifying for me, because I do think that like trauma, like colloquially kind of means like something bad happened and now I'm traumatized, but it's a lot more complicated than that. So I really appreciated that section.
Great, great. Yeah, and I also think that there's, now that trauma has become a little bit more popularized, right? Just like you said, to say like, oh my God, I saw this really scary movie and I'm so traumatized by it, right? That we can throw the term around, and what that does is it really diminishes the experience of people that are like, you know, impacted by serious trauma. And on the flip side, I'm reading Gabor Mate's book, The Myth of Normal right now, which is a really fascinating book where he's also inviting us though to think about toxic stress and the ways that we can be traumatized without experiencing a traumatic experience, like just through chronic and sustained levels of stress. So it's like, how do we have this complex view of trauma? And to your point, understand that trauma is not in the event or circumstance, it's in how we respond to it. And that discomfort isn't necessarily trauma. Discomfort, like, you know, to really be interrogating what trauma is and isn't, I think is so important. So thank you for uplifting that. Anything else? Did anything else stand out for you or feel confusing to you? You know, it doesn't have to just be like stuff that worked, but like stuff that you're like, that didn't like make sense to me, you know, in this paradigm. Yes, see a hand.
You said earlier that self-regulation and grounding and noticing yourself can be difficult when trauma can hold that process. So how do we teach yoga to someone? How do we teach self-regulation to someone whose self-regulation is haunted by trauma?
I want to make sure I heard you. Did you say like, can we teach self-regulation to somebody who might be impacted by trauma?
Yes.
Yeah. You know, I think that I'm not sure who the we is to teach the self-regulation. I'm not sure what you mean by that question. Are you just talking about like as an individual? Are you talking about organizationally?
Individual wise, yes. This is on the context of you were talking about teaching yoga to incarcerated victims who were also criminalized for being victims.
Yeah. So I think that, you know, really simple tools of embodiment can be accessible to everybody. One of my teachers is a woman named Pat Kane, who brought really simple tools to communities that were dealing with political violence and genocide. And she would do Qigong with them, and she would do some yoga poses with them. And they would take what worked for them and go teach it to their communities. And it was very, very powerful. And she was very passionate about a public education model for these simple somatic tools, that you don't have to have any special training or anything to share breathing or some stretching or Qigong, right? So on one level, these are very simple things that we can share with one another, right? On another level, you know, you are not trauma therapists. You are not there to take people deep into their traumas or try to heal trauma, but we can share with one another tools to help us stay grounded and breathing and present in the face of our discomfort, right? While also knowing when to really offer resources for deeper support. So in terms of the organizational change, it really is about building in simple practices of embodiment that can work for everybody, with this caveat of offering them in a way that invites people to notice what works for you and what doesn't. Just like when I did the yoga class, right? It was the empowerment, the choice was inside of you. So I hope that helps. I could talk about that. I could answer that question in like 20 hours of conversation, but yeah.
Also, I would point to your website and to different places where you actually do offer people tools and some of your videos that are publicly accessible, so you can go and just as Hala said, some of the most profound tools for this are very simple. It's just about practicing them regularly and putting intention into like getting what you can from it. But I think you have things on your website that they could explore and find some more about. And we'll do a little bit throughout this class. Each week, I'll sprinkle in different things that will be take to.
Yeah. Well, I know that our time is up. I want to thank you all for your participation today, and so excited for y'all to be in this class. It's such a great experience, and you have a wonderful leader with Tessa as your teacher. I'm happy to be available on email or anything if y'all have questions or want more resources, or I can support you in any way in your journey.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
All right. Have a great rest of your day.
We're doing another restorative transformative justice meeting this Thursday at 6:30. Like taking care of this meeting is really awesome. And I'll send it in class.